Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 5, Episode 2. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion. Where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. 1 week in to the 5th season of this podcast, I make a declaration about how I'm going to be a less judgmental, less sharp-tongued, less cynical podcast host. That lasted all of 1 week. Here we are in week 2. Matt Gaetz is Florida man royalty, and I always knew Skip Bayless was a cunt. Thank you all for listening, particularly those that have been with me for these 5 seasons. It is very much appreciated. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, and you like the fact that you don't hear any ads, please consider supporting.
Act 1. Matt Gaetz is Florida man royalty.
The Congressional Ethics Report came out with regard to Matt Gaetz, and I was going to posture the way I was going to present my thoughts about it in a lawyers because people are dumb segment. After learning more about what happened in this case, specifically what didn't happen in the state of Florida with the Florida Attorney General refusing or neglecting to file any charges against Gaetz after all this information came out, Matt Gaetz really isn't dumb. He's just a spoiled cunt. He may be quintessential Florida man. He may be the more Cartier version of Florida man, but he's Florida man with Florida man hierarchy. He is Florida man royalty. His father was the president of the Senate in Florida for, I think, over a decade. The Gaetz family is very prominent in politics in the state of Florida. Now, if you don't know what I'm referring to about the ethics report, why the Florida Attorney General was negligent, if not completely complicit, in allowing Matt Gaetz to get away with what he did, Gaetz was somewhat of a playboy in his 30s. That's how it's being postured in the media. Gaetz, the man about town, the playboy. Well, let me clarify that statement. That was how it was postured in the media for roughly 24 months. And now that some of these allegations have come out and they are a bit more sinister, it's not so much that he was a playboy, it's that he, like his contemporary on the other side of the aisle, one Hunter Biden, liked to have sex with prostitutes. He liked to get high on drugs and have sex with prostitutes. Why was I going to posture all of these thoughts on a lawyers because people are dumb segment? Gaetz went on a website called Seeking Arrangement. Now, I've heard of this website, unfortunately, because I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and both men in this community and women in this community are on that website. It is basically a website where younger women will go to look for more affluent older men. You could call it a sugar daddy, sugar baby website. You could also call it pay for sex. Gaetz used this website to meet younger women that he could pay for sex, and because he's a genius, he did all of this online in a forum where all of his history could be tracked. He was basically Venmoing 18, 19, 20-year-old girls money, and he didn't even make his Venmo history private. Now, if you've ever used Venmo, you understand what that means. In each one of your transactions, you can actually elect to make it public or private. And it's in this kind of blockchain recording that all the transactions that you've had and who you've transacted with and what the transaction was for, it's right there in this timeline. And you can either make that public or you can keep it private. I have a hard time believing that this guy didn't know that all of these transactions were public. Maybe he just was ignorant. Maybe he was just so brazen that he didn't care. Yes, brazen. That's what resonates. That he was so brazen because he was top of the food chain Florida man. Let's call it for what it is. He's part of Florida political royalty. He's top of the food chain, top of the totem pole Florida man. So he and this guy that he becomes friends with, who is making fake IDs as part of his job as Secretary of State for the state of Florida. I believe that was his position. There's a number of different things that fall under that position, but one of them is voter registration and IDs. So he's making fake IDs for these 18, 19, 20-year-old girls that he and Gaetz are having sex with by paying them money through Venmo. Through fucking Venmo. Understand what I'm about to say to you, dear listener. I cannot verbally define, I cannot verbally articulate to you over this podcast what it is like to live in Scottsdale and to go out in the Scottsdale social scene, to be in Old Town or to be in certain parts of Arcadia or North Scottsdale. I cannot give you a better visual or oral representation of the embodiment of the Scottsdale douchebag than one Matt Gaetz. Alleged playboy, alleged man about town, and the whole thing is bought and paid for. To the extent that he ever has a woman around him, she's being paid. And not, oh, he's got money, I'm going to go out with him for free drinks, free meals, VIP access to the club. No, she's also getting paid directly to be in this person's presence. That's the Scottsdale douchebag. That's Matt Gaetz. It comes out that one of the women that Gaetz had sex with through this website, Seeking Arrangements, was 17 years old when he had sex with her. He's 35, 36 at the time, so it's statutory rape. Now, do I believe that Gaetz knew that this was a minor? No, I don't believe he knew that at all. And although it's statutory rape, let's not take away the culpability of this girl who's 17 years old going onto a website where, for all intents and purposes, she's prostituting herself. And everyone can now talk about, well, look at the socioeconomic situation that she was in and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure that if you go back and you look at photos of that girl contemporaneous to the time that she was on the Seeking Arrangements website, she had an expensive bag. She had expensive shoes. She had very expensive looking jewelry and clothes. I have no doubt that this girl came from a socioeconomically depressed background, that she may have had a very difficult childhood. Although those things may be true, we can't absolve her of her terrible decisions, and we also can't absolve people of being completely wrapped up in this nonsensical influencer culture, which is all bullshit in the first place, and this story illustrates as much. I mean, is this story not a perfect example of a guy who was trying to be the playboy and was bragging about it to anyone that would listen, who was in earshot, and we're going to get to that. But in reality, what's he doing? He's paying all these girls to hang around him, and what do the girls get out of it? The money, so that they can go and buy the things that they want to look like the social influencers that they are so attracted to, that they want to model themselves after, and the whole thing is a farce. It's all a house of cards. We all know that to be the truth, yet there's so many people that are sucked in to this false reality. I want to examine with you, dear listener, the psychology of the type of people who are so sucked into this. Matt Gaetz went up to contemporaries in the House of Representatives, in the Senate of the United States of America. This isn't the Florida State Senate. This isn't the Florida House of Representatives. The man was elected to a federal congressional seat. He was going to members of the House of Representatives and the Senate and showing them pictures of women that he was paying to have sex and trying to brag about the fact that he was, quote unquote, with these women, that these women were his girlfriends, I guess, or that he was dating them. Think about the psychology of that. He is going on a website called Seeking Arrangements. He's paying for these girls to have sex with him, to bring him drugs, and then he goes to members of the highest body of representation in our government. And the thing that he has to talk about with them is not policy, it's not procedure. It's, hey, look at the girl that I was with this weekend. Isn't she hot? Oh, look at this photo of her in my car. She's completely naked. What comes through me is someone who has never felt truly validated, who has never felt truly secure in who they are. If you need that type of validation from professional colleagues in that type of environment, what does that say about you and the level of desperation that you have to be acknowledged, to be recognized? There are members of the media that are trying to make, and I think the legacy media in general, trying to make this out like Gaetz is some kind of predator or this is some kind of unique situation and he's some kind of unique psychology, a unique bad guy. Is that what you see, dear listener? Is that what is being presented to us in what Matt Gaetz is? I mean, is not Matt Gaetz a product of the social media influencer culture? It doesn't matter what the reality is as long as you're able to present something that you believe validates you in that instant moment. You get yourself into a cycle then where you were constantly needing additional external validation by any means necessary. I'll quickly comment on the Department of Justice and the congressional investigation. So a lot of people are now clamoring for the Department of Justice to do something, and the fact that maybe there was a cover-up, and the fact that the Department of Justice never took action against Gaetz when this information was presented. And the problem is that the Department of Justice really doesn't have a lot of power and authority based on federal law to do anything. These women weren't being held against their will. They weren't being transported over state lines against their will. It's very difficult to discern whether or not the money that Gaetz gave these women was specifically for sex or was for drugs. Are there some federal charges that you could gin up based on what Matt Gaetz had done? Yes, I'm sure there are. Are they strong federal charges? No, they're not. I've talked about this on the podcast before. There's not an ideological bent to a state prosecutor or a federal prosecutor. They look at a case and it's either win or lose. If I don't think that I can 100% win this case, then I'm not bringing it, because they're judged only on one thing: wins and losses. So they don't have an ideological streak where they say, oh, we may not have the strongest case. The law may not be particularly on our side, or the facts may not be particularly on our side, but this is just, this is right, and we're going to bring these charges anyway. Bullshit. That's for movies. That's for TV. In reality, prosecutors look at the law and they look at the facts, and they also look at the defendant. They look at the person that they're going to be prosecuting. If this is a high-profile prosecution and they're going to be able to bring to bear money by way of very capable defense attorneys, we are not going to put ourselves in a position where we end up having egg all over our face by losing this case. We're not going to bring the charges. The charges to be brought were in Florida by the Florida Attorney General for statutory rape, and that was never done. And why? Because Matt Gaetz, although he may be a spoiled little cunt, he is Florida man political royalty. Final note, the Department of Justice does not give the congressional hearing all of its investigation, recordings, transcripts, what have you. And that's not uncommon. The Department of Justice is very protective of their investigations. It's a basic separation of powers, power struggle. Congress is part of the legislative branch. The Department of Justice is part of the executive branch, and they don't like to share and cooperate. So the Department of Justice routinely withholds information as part of their investigations from congressional investigations. You may hear some nonsense about, oh, well, this was part of a grand jury subpoena and the grand jury was closed and we can't give out that information. I'm sure that there are procedurally circumstances where that's accurate. But the foundation of the conflict between the Department of Justice and congressional investigations is, hey, you're part of the legislative branch. We're part of the executive branch. We don't answer to you. Go fuck yourself. Ultimately, all of this is to say, Matt Gaetz very likely got away with everything that he got away with because he did it in Florida, and he is Florida man political royalty. Another spoiled cunt that's a wannabe player, a wannabe playboy, that at its foundation was just as corrupt as any other wannabe playboy that you've ever heard of, showing up at the right spot in Old Town with the rented Ferrari and the rented condo at the Scottsdale waterfront, living it up, buying drinks at the bar, buying bottle service at the club, all on a credit card. It reeks of desperation. Someone desperate for validation that doesn't feel validated internally, that isn't comfortable with oneself, has to seek that validation externally. That makes Gaetz the quintessential politician, the definition of a politician. Someone that's not comfortable with who they are, that is constantly seeking external validation to make themselves feel desired, wanted, complete, whole. It won't be long, dear listener. Matt Gaetz will be the next governor of Florida.
Act 2. I always knew Skip Bayless was a cunt.
I'll go ahead and address as much right off the bat. I made a pledge at the very first episode, season 5, episode 1, trying to be less judgmental, trying to look at things from below instead of above, trying not to allow my ego to come out during my note-taking process or during the stream of consciousness that I'll do in anticipation of creating these pieces. And yet here I am, not only allowing my ego to make its presence felt, but allowing it really to take a lap or two on this segment, to take control of the wheel, so to speak. Longtime listeners of the show know, people who know me for longer than this podcast has existed, they know I never understood Skip Bayless. I never understood the phenomenon. He was always such a cunt. I didn't get it. I didn't get how what he did translated so well into the world of sports, such that he was one of the most popular commentators on sports for years on 2 of the largest sports networks that exist, ESPN and Fox. I appreciate there's a Howard Stern factor, and if you understand what I mean by that, that little light is probably going off in your head. The hamster wheel is now spinning. For those of you who don't understand, when Howard Stern first came on the air in New York way back in the 80s, and his numbers were so high, there were a number of people in his own organization. They weren't fans of his show. They weren't fans of what he was doing to talk radio. But his numbers spoke for themselves. So they took polls, poll after poll. Why are you listening? Why do you keep coming back? And what was crazy was that they found there were people who were diehard Stern adherents. They loved what he was doing. But that was only half of his audience. The other half of his audience that tuned in day after day after day stated that they hated what he was doing and that they hated what he was saying. And yet, they felt compelled to continue to tune in day after day after day. Skip Bayless is the Howard Stern of sports commentary. He appeals to, I assume, a very lowbrow, simple-minded, I'll use the term, I'll harken back to one Hillary Clinton, a basket of deplorables. The fans of Skip Bayless are a basket full of deplorables. And ostensibly, the other side of the Skip Bayless universe is people who continue to tune in to what he does, what he says, knowing that they're going to disagree with him. It's their form of outrage porn. One of my buddies who has been on this show numerous times, Jason, he does the NBA segments with me. He sometimes comes on the 4 Idiots Discuss Sports segments. He's a Northern Virginia guy. That puts him squarely in the sights of the Washington Nationals for baseball, the Washington Commanders for football, the Bullets for basketball, and he is a on-again, off-again Washington Capitals fan. I say that only because he loves the NBA so much. There's only so much bandwidth he's going to give to the NHL during the NBA season. I can remember sitting there watching this cold pizza show with him thinking to myself, this is the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my entire life. This guy Bayless is a buffoon. This whole thing is so stupid and contrived. And of course, because I was a much younger man and everyone wanted to hear my opinions, I vocalized this very quickly. What was interesting was that Jason saw the writing on the wall well before I did. That this type of interaction, this contrived buffoonery where you just argue about these nonsensical hypotheticals, diehard sports fan enjoys that. Who am I really talking about? The type of person that in a two-party household, there's a husband, there's a wife, there may be kids, and their collective income is less than $100,000, and they spend, let's say, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year on season tickets to an NFL team, an NBA team. That person, that guy, likes the Skip Baylesses of the world. He likes this contrarian nonsense. The rise of that stupid shit kept me from starting a podcast or doing anything sports related for nearly a decade. When I looked at the landscape, what was being consumed, I said to myself, if that's what they want a cunt like that, they can have it. I don't want any part of it. It only took 20 years, but Skip Bayless, who left ESPN to go to Fox Sports, ends up getting bounced from Fox Sports because what he does has run so dry when it comes to the collective sports landscape that he wasn't worth the money that he was demanding to stay at the network. And he probably wasn't worth the headaches. And what do I mean by he probably wasn't worth the headaches? Because what was known about him when he left has now been made public in a lawsuit by a former hairstylist who says that he's basically a cunt. Note, there have been stories over the years about how hard a worker Skip Bayless was and how dedicated to his craft he was, and that part of what he was doing was somewhat of a shtick that was very lucrative for him. But if you actually look at the history of Skip Bayless, when he was a reporter in Dallas, he's always been a cunt. He's always been a me-first, ladder-climbing cunt. The guy made his name in a book about the Dallas Cowboys where he speculated that Troy Aikman was gay, and he was never able to substantiate, hiding behind journalism, his journalism ethics. He was never able to substantiate those claims because he said he was protecting his sources. But it was that kind of sensationalist bullshit that elevated him to the point where he could be a cunt, offering nonsensical takes about sports for 20, 25 years. This woman alleges that basically she, among others, suffered sexual harassment at the hands of one Skip Bayless. And in the climate of Fox around 2014, 2015, 2016, I believe Bayless joined Fox in 2016. Is it that unbelievable that the type of atmosphere that was fostered at Fox News that we know was just a cauldron of sexual harassment and a bunch of fucking dorks, that it actually elevated their profile such that now that they were millionaires and that they thought that they could do anything that they wanted? Is it not possible that that same culture existed in a sports network where you had people like Skip Bayless, who again, pretty much a fucking dork, who elevated his profile through what amounted to no more than yellow journalism? Is it that unbelievable that this type of person would be sexually harassing the staff at a news network, at a sports network? What I found so bold about the complaint that was filed against Fox and against Skip Bayless in particular was that it was filed as a class action, that the plaintiff's attorneys were so bold that they thought to themselves, there are so many people that suffered through this same type of conduct that once we file this complaint and provide the platform for these people to have a voice, they're going to come flooding in. Only time will tell if that contention is going to be supported. But given what we know happened at Fox News, it's very likely that if this conduct is true, that the representations are accurate, that there were a number of other women who suffered through them or were present while they were going on who were going to join in this lawsuit. I don't want to look at Skip Bayless the way I did at Matt Gaetz, because we know that the allegations against Gaetz are true. They have been verified by a congressional investigative body, and they've also been verified by the Department of Justice. Gaetz himself didn't necessarily deny that those allegations were true. He just tried to reframe them or cast them in a different light. Whereas we don't know if these allegations against Bayless are true. Removing myself from my ego, I have to give the man the benefit of the doubt. But my ego steps up and says, fuck that cunt. He probably did it. He is exactly the type of narcissistic dork that got shit on very likely all throughout his high school and college days, thinking that he was a bigger man that he was given credit for. And when he finally got enough money and clout where he was able to allow all of those demons to exercise themselves, he would definitely go up to a woman and say, I'll give you $1.5 million to have sex with me. What's interesting about this story, and this is where I am going to try to look at it from below instead of above, who has empowered Skip Bayless to become this type of monster? It's really not ESPN or Fox. The money came after the audience did, which is to say, it's us. It's the fact that we continue to patronize an ESPN or a Fox, not just when Skip Bayless is on a program, but specifically because he is on a program. It's sports fan number one that empowered this man. And that's one of the reasons why in the first and second episodes of this very podcast 4 years ago, I was questioning my own sports fandom. If the guy sitting next to me in any arena or any venue is someone that is patronizing the ESPNs of the world and the Foxes of the world because they want to hear the next thing that Skip Bayless has to say, what the hell am I doing? I don't want to shit all over that person. I don't want to be judgmental. But I have a hard time sitting there thinking this is something that I'm supporting with my dollars and my attention, and it disgusts me. All right then. My ego has had its lap around the course. I'm going to put it down now, and I'm going to wrap this up by saying, in the most equanimous way that I can, from the most equanimous place that I can, I always knew Skip Bayless was a cunt. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.